IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. As you know, we tend to have episodes on history every Friday, and today we have a particularly interesting one for you. I know that I say that for every single episode, but this is interesting even by my standards, because we're going to be talking about an angle of history that we haven't really very often touched upon in All Things Policy, and that is the queens of medieval India. Now, generally, when we think about Indian history, the tendency today is to think of these big chest-thumping, hairy dudes going at it with swords on the middle of a battlefield and then coming back to their luxurious forts and whatnot. But the reality of history, as you can imagine, is always so much more complicated than that. And though Bollywood might like us to believe that queens were either acrobats who fought alongside their men on battlefields like Bollywood heroines do, or these martyrs who burned themselves to save their family's honor, once again, the reality of what medieval queens did is far more complex and interesting than we might imagine. I have with me today academic and writer Dr. Devika Rangachari. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Rangachari.
Thank you, Anirudh. It's a pleasure to be here having this conversation with you.
I'm super excited. So Dr. Rangachari writes some really, really interesting books. I happened to come across her work because I got really interested in medieval Odisha, and she has a fantastic volume called From Obscurity to Light, where she talks about some really remarkable Odia queens, especially from the Bhaumakara dynasty, who kind of actually handed the throne directly from one to the other without any men kind of getting in the way. They're very interesting characters. We'll touch upon them hopefully in a separate recording. But what we're going to be talking about today is Dr. Rangachari's work on the queens of medieval Kashmir. And I happened to read her fascinating work for young adults called Queen of Ice. It's basically historical fiction that is based on the life of the Kashmiri queen Bidda, who's a really remarkable early medieval character, outlasts many of her grandsons and rules for decades and really makes Kashmir one of the great powers of its day. But she's not really a figure that's very often talked about in non-nationalist senses, if you know what I mean. So what we're going to be doing over the course of this podcast is we're going to talk a little bit about what kind of roles medieval Indian queens really played. How can we find them in the historical texts of the time? And what do these historical texts tell us about the lives that these queens led and their motivations for coming to and retaining power? So without any further ado, let's begin. Dr. Rangachari, can you first tell us a little bit about how you go about finding queens? Generally speaking, most of the texts that survive from the medieval period tend to really focus on men and their exploits. How do you manage to infer the presence of women and what they were doing through these kinds of texts?
Yeah, so thanks for that wonderful introduction, Anirudh. So if I could give a slightly a long answer to your question, the thing is that when I was looking for something some research to do for my MPhil dissertation, my supervisor at the time, Professor Anirudh Kanisetii, who herself is a well-known historian, she suggested that I look at the Raj Tarangani, which is basically a chronicle of Kashmir written by this poet called Kalhana, and who sort of looked upon himself as a historian and who's written the history of Kashmir from the earliest times to his own, which is around 1150 AD. So she suggested I look at it and, just read the text. It's in Sanskrit, and to see whether there was anything interesting that I could actually focus on. So when I was reading the text, I realized that there were mentions of these remarkable women who seem to play a very important role in the polity and society of early Kashmir, ancient Kashmir and early medieval Kashmir, and who were otherwise not finding too much mention in secondary sources on Kashmir. So they seem to be almost invisible in the mainstream historical narrative, but were constantly appearing in this text. And I realized that this kind of fracture between, these two discourses was something that I really needed to explore. And so I began to study the text of my MPhil and realized that there was, I mean, of course, we're all aware of this gender bias in the writing of history, but it struck me so forcibly when I was reading this text that I realized that this is something that I really wanted to, look at further and to explore and to actually extend my inquiries to, areas that were contemporary with early medieval Kashmir. So, other areas in the north. So this is how I happened to end up researching women who were made largely invisible in the mainstream narrative, but who really existed and played powerful roles in the early medieval period, that is roughly from the 7th to the 12th century AD, across North India. So I looked at Kashmir, Kannauj, Bengal, and Bihar. And then for my postdoctoral research, I just extended my inquiry to Orissa at the same period. So actually, the title of my doctoral work says it all. It's Invisible Women, Visible History. So you presume these women are invisible if you only engage with the secondary sources, but their histories are completely visible if you really care to look into them. And how I go about my research is basically I look at texts, inscriptions, coins, but it's largely literary and epigraphic. And in the case of early medieval Kashmir, almost completely textual, because there's Kalhana's Rajtarangini is such a brilliant text which gives you all the information that you actually need to reconstruct the history of Kashmir from the earliest times to the 12th century. So you can't actually attempt the history of this region without taking recourse to this text. There are some inscriptions, but they're very few. They're badly preserved. The same for the coins. But they're actually corroborative evidence for the information that Kalhana mentions in his text. So they're also useful in their own way.
Okay, this is absolutely fascinating. So we're talking about primary sources that actually mention these queens as fairly important characters. But for whatever reason, the secondary research by which we're referring to historians who have looked at these texts and tried to construct modern histories out of them have chosen to kind of erase these women from these stories. Why do you think that is, Dr. Rangachari?
I think this gender bias is ubiquitous and it's insidious, and sometimes we don't even realize it. I mean, I remember thinking when I was beginning my doctoral research on the irony is the fact that I had been studying history for so many years, and it's apparently specializing in it in a big way, but was only dimly aware of the fact that there was this gender bias. And I mean, this is not just true of the writing of Indian history. It's there all over the world. I mean, if you read, for example, biographies of Cleopatra, you'll understand how insidious the gender bias is. I think it's a factor of men having had access to education all through the past, and therefore being considered able to write the histories, and who therefore decided that women were trivial to the whole to the reconstruction of the past. But there's also the fact that we are dealing with largely patriarchal structures everywhere. So inherent in a patriarchal structure is the assumption that women are irrelevant, or who are basically insignificant, and you need to see them only within the context of the household, the inner sphere, that they don't have any space in the public domain. And oddly enough, a lot of modern historians seem to have just unconsciously adopted this kind of assumption, and it's also, interestingly, it applies to both men and women historians. So it's not as if it's only the male historians who are showing this bias. It's also a lot of female historians as well, which is something of an eye-opener to me when I was looking at my sources. And the irony is that when you look at the original sources, they're actually telling you a completely different picture from the one that you're actually deriving from these, mainstream histories. Because the early medieval period is a very, very important one in terms of changes in, polity, society, economy, religion, and so on. But women do not form, any discursive space in that period. I mean, the whole the trend is to see them as a practically undifferentiated group that's sitting somewhere on the periphery, and whose status sort of mechanically changes to reflect larger changes around them. Whereas when you look at the original sources, they're actually telling you, an alternative, much richer, comprehensive picture, one in which women are actually either on the throne or behind the throne, and court participants, donors, builders, and this is true of both royal and non-royal women in a lot of cases. So yeah, I guess it just depends on the eyes with which you view, the sources and what kind of history you're trying to reconstruct.
That's fascinating. I'm sure any of our listeners who are also history nerds like we are, and who have read, for example, Neelakanta Shastri or any of the great giants of South Indian history, would have realized that there's very often like a second part of their books. The first half is always about the politics and wars of the great men, and in the second half, in the section on society, there'll be a subsection on women that kind of lists out all the royal women as if they are creatures that have absolutely no agency.
Yes,
and
there
who
are these
somehow
generalizations made about them and their roles, and usually, their status is seen as something like a seesaw. Their status rose and fell as if, it's sort of they have no engagement with what is happening around them, and usually any discussion on women is juxtaposed between discussions on the pastimes and amusements and
yes.
food that the people in the past ate. So by their very relegation into one sort of obscure corner, you're showing that women don't really matter.
Exactly.
And yeah.
Incidentally, while we're on the subject of how sources distort from our understanding of reality, you might be interested in taking the Takshila Institution's courses. The Takshila Institution, as all of you know, is a think tank and a school of public policy. We do a whole bunch of fascinating courses on public policy, defense and foreign affairs, and of course, technology policy. I myself, I'm an alumnus of the public policy program, and as you can see, it has done wonders for me. So if you're interested in applying, the deadline for our courses is the 28th of August. You can visit www.takshila.org.in/courses if you're interested. Now, coming back, of course, to the discussion. Sorry for that aside. But we were talking about how sources distort our understanding of women from the medieval period. So what exactly do the sources really tell us about these women? If we were to just leave aside all the secondary research, leave aside all the misogyny and the assumptions and the invisibilizing, as you said, of these women, what are they doing in the medieval period?
Okay, so I basically looked at the early medieval period in North India broadly, and a bit of the East as well. And I divided women into these two broad categories that, of course, is in itself problematic, but, it was just for the purpose of convenience. I divided them into royal and non-royal women. So royal are those, the queens, those associated directly with the throne who married into royalty or whatever. And the non-royal are the whole category of women, the other women. So, and what are they doing? Well, this is a deeply contextual question because, you cannot have one statement that applies to all of North India and a particular time span to say that women's, roles were the same or they had the same progression and so on, because it differed. I mean, in early medieval Kashmir, women had a huge presence in every part of polity, society, economy, every single sphere of life. Whereas the role is more diluted when you move towards early medieval Kannauj, for example. But the different specific phases of history in which women were prominent and are documented as being so, and some in which the presence is not very known. And then you move to Bengal and Bihar, where again there are certain phases of history where women were playing very, very important roles and attesting their presence through donations, through inscriptions, and so on. And other phases where you don't really hear too much about them. So the whole it's a period in which again your source material differs. As I said, in early medieval Kashmir, you need textual sources more, and then you move to Bengal and Bihar, where it's largely epigraphic, a lot of inscriptions, and not too much textual material, and Kannauj, where there is a conjunction between the two. So in early medieval Kashmir, women they had, a lot of authority that was both formal and informal. So women exercise both power, which can be loosely described as the ability to get what one wants through influence, through manipulation, through coercion, through other forms of agency. And they exercise authority, which is the legitimized right to enforce decisions. So they were either on the throne or behind the throne. And in fact, the throne was a source of authority for both royal and non-royal women. So, it cut across time spans and dynasties, and it was open to everybody. So the diverse origins of rulers and queens is a pointer to that. And of course, in society, in economy, in fact, there are various social groupings that, for example, prostitutes who were given great prominence in early medieval Kashmir and seen as respectable citizens and so on. And of course, early medieval Kashmir is not typical of all of that time span. But there is, when you put all these regions together and you look at their histories, you realize that you cannot actually make generalizations about women in the early medieval period without looking at these regional variations, without understanding how women were able to actually transgress patriarchal structures in a lot of places. And you also realize the huge importance, the centrality of gender reconstruction in any kind of historical, reconstruction of the past. You can't actually leave out what women were doing and their relations with men and the tensions and negotiations between them when you're trying to uncover the past, which is something that an alarming majority of historians do. This is in a nutshell what women were doing in this period.
How absolutely fascinating. Now, I have a whole bunch of questions, but before we get to them, we are going to just cut away to a short ad break.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another great week on the IVM Podcast Network. If you aren't following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Would like to thank the sponsors on the network this week, Cred, Ciet, and Global Victoria. Thank you so much for making this possible. On Cyrus Says, Cyrus is joined by the hilarious and extremely charming illusionist and therapist Suhani Shah. They talk about different aspects of magic like sleight of hand, mind reading, mentalism, and more. The Habit Coach completed 500 episodes, 500, and Ashton has a special message for us on the occasion. Do check that out. We had Lekhini Desai, founder of the India Ethnic Company, talk to Varun Digirala about their story and the Hatke marketing idea that made them popular. On Naan Curry, Sadaf and Archit celebrated World Chocolate Day. They took us through the origins, history, economics of chocolate, and shared their memories. On Tere Mere Raste, Keshu Chaturvedi shares an interesting story from Leh. Check out an updated version of the Traveling Professor's Diary. It's now rechristened as Smarter with Sid. Same old brain filled with news stories and insights. This time, listening to know why you should keep things simple. And finally, check out Global Victoria Tech Talks. This one is in partnership with Global Victoria, the trade arm of the Government of Victoria and Australia. The edtech and gaming industries are booming in Victoria, Australia, and this series is meant to showcase that. And with that, let's get you back to your show.
And we're back. So before we cut off, we were having a discussion about the kind of roles that medieval women actually played. And that leads me to a whole bunch of questions which I'm going to ask right now. The first is, Dr. Rangachari, I really enjoyed the point that you repeatedly made about the impossibility of making any kind of generalization about the role that medieval Indian women played, because this is something that secondary research is notoriously prone to, right?
Yes.
Alone the public domain. People in general are like, Indian queens this, Indian queens that.
Yes, absolutely.
We are talking about a time span of thousands of years over a landmass that is about the size of Western Europe. And still, these generalizations are made because of this kind of assumption almost that Indian culture is this homogeneous, never-changing kind of entity, where at most there are these rise and falls, as you mentioned. But overall, the dominant pattern that people imagine is that it's all about conformity to the norm. But medieval Kashmir offers us so many fascinating examples of how the norm itself is totally different. So let me try to understand a little bit about what he meant when he said about women drawing power from the throne. Does that mean that, for example, courtesans who are also prominent in medieval Kashmir generally only tended to be prominent if they were connected to the throne?
No, that's not true. Basically, Kalhana enables us to see a lot of courtesans and prostitutes being almost kingmakers, naming their own candidates to the throne sometimes, intervening in royal politics in very significant ways by actually, saving the life of a future contender to the throne, or, sometimes enabling their brothers to name themselves as candidates to the throne. But even otherwise, apart from the Raj Tarangani, there is this text of around 8th century Kashmir called the Nilmat Puran, which is basically an account of the formation of Kashmir and the customs and traditions to be followed in order to keep the land prosperous. So, in fact, Kalhana uses some details from the Neelamat Puran for his history of Kashmir. And it's interesting there that among the rituals to be followed and the life of the social life that we get from this text, one of the important strictures is to pay a lot of respect to prostitutes, to that they are equated with prominent citizens. They are supposed to participate in all the rituals that that the citizens are supposed to join in, and they're seen as auspicious beings and so on. So this is of course radically different from the view that we get of them otherwise in other texts and other sources and secondary histories and so on. So it's very interesting. So they didn't actually need to be connected to the throne in any way. A lot of them were court participants, yes, but even otherwise, they enjoyed this prominence in society, this respect, in this milieu. So
that's absolutely fascinating. And what about royal women, though? Now, I imagine that the way that we think about these royal women is that they're essentially nothing more than devoted wives and mothers. But one of the things I really enjoy about your research is the fact that you actually point to so many specific examples of these women actually being proud of their birth families and kind of retaining the connection to their birth families and using the resources of their birth families to advance their own power and admission. So how is this reflected in the text? What does Kalhana have to say about this kind of thing?
So Kalhana, as I said, likes to view himself as an objective historian and treats women as relevant historical figures. So and he actually recounts their influence, the importance that they give to their natal families, the way in which they determine the future history of Kashmir in very objective terms. Sometimes he has sharply divergent views, so you can see the struggle in his head between trying to reconcile prescriptive strictures with what is actually happening in practice. But otherwise, he enables us to reconstruct a scenario where, as I said, the throne was a source of legitimate authority for royal and non-royal women. So even if they weren't sitting on the throne, there were these huge influences behind the throne. They're advising their husbands to rule. There are these instances of, for example, there's this 11th century queen called Suryamati who actually rescues. The throne has been pawned by her husband, the king. She actually manages to get it back. And then she forces him to abdicate in favor of their son. She dictates state policy. She, and this is also mentioned in a text called the Vikramanka Deva Charitam, written by Bilhana in the 11th century. Right. She actually talks about how important Suryamati is, how she's conversant with state policy, how she builds these granaries, how she, basically administers the state. But again, this text has been analyzed in several different ways, but the information that is provided on her is routinely ignored. So, another example of the huge gender bias, when we're talking about Queen Bidda, who's focus of my book for young adults called Queen of Ice, she actually not only rules Kashmir for around 50 years, 25 of them formal, 25 informal, but she actually bequeaths the throne of Kashmir to her natal family from Lohara. So when she dies, the throne passes in undisputed succession to her natal family, to her nephew, her brother's son, actually. So, the importance of natal connections are repeatedly stressed. In fact, Bidda's maternal grandfather, Bhimadeva, is able to build a temple in Kashmir, as a symbol of the connection that he has with his granddaughter who's ruling there. So there's several very interesting examples of the importance of natal connections. The fact in which queens are quite unapologetic about the fact that yes, they come from certain families and they're not averse to promoting those families and flaunting those connections.
I absolutely love it. Let me just actually recommend Queen of Ice to all of our listeners. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and you will, as soon as you pick it up, you're going to see how a lot of the themes that we're touching upon in this conversation are actually reflected in the book. One thing that I particularly enjoyed was the relationship that Didda has with her husband, Kshema Gupta, and this very interesting detail that you put in of the people of of Srinagar, calling them Diddakshema as a kind of pair, and then the king actually commissioning coins with Diddakshema on them. That's a bit of a tongue twister, sorry. And I was actually having these coins as these living testaments to the fact that these queens did have these very intense relationships with their husbands. And they weren't just these shrinking violets who were sitting behind a veil and waiting for men to come and rescue them and fight over them or whatever. They were actively taking steps to seize power, to retain power for themselves. And as Diddak shows, she uses that power to raise up the status of her natal family. That's something that we don't very often think about. I mean, think about family honor and women. We generally think of the exact opposite. We think of women having to protect family honor by kind of hiding away from the general public. But here we see the exact opposite, where women are increasing the prominence of their families and are being celebrated for doing so. That's just so fascinating to me.
Yeah, it is fascinating. In fact, this Diddakshema, the coins of the Diddakshema type, are actually available if you go to the Sri Pratap Singh Museum in Srinagar. You can actually see these coins, and that's quite thrilling because here's a detail that directly corroborates what Kalhana says. He's mentioning these coins as an indication of Didda's influence on her husband Chemagupta, and there you have the coin right in front of you to show
Exactly.
you that this is what it is. And it's also interesting that, of course, Didda. There are 3 women rulers of Kashmir, one of whom is not really well known, but the other 2, Sugandha and Didda, are they're fairly well documented, at least in the Rajtarangani, not otherwise. But it's interesting that they don't make any attempts to pander to the public to gain acceptance. They don't dress up as males in the manner in which, say, Razia Sultan did, and
Rudramadevi in the Kakatiya.
Rudramadevi, the Kakatiya, yeah. They don't do that, and in fact, Didda refers to her herself alternately as male and by male and female titles. In her coins and inscriptions. So she's both Deva, she's also Ragi. So this thing about, but the a bulk of historians want to sort of conventionalize their figures, so they're uncomfortable with these powerful women using their regency as stepping stones to acquire power and actually being ambitious and wanting to rule. So there are all these attempts to say that oh no, actually they were pious people and actually they went to temples and so on and so forth, when the reality is quite different.
So here's the interesting thing about temples, right? Very often we tend to see them today in this highly religiously and nationalistically charged political environment. We tend to see them only as these symbols of piety, but in reality, to their makers, as inscriptions reveal, I think they were very much also objects of power. To be able to build a temple, to have your name associated with it, and to be able to kind of trumpet that fact was extremely important to medieval dynasties. The fact that that Didda's grandfather built his temple in Kashmir, even though he was a king of a different region, is one example of that.
Yeah.
And then, of course, there's the fact that Didda herself commissioned these things, but they're not just these pious characters. Another interesting thing that you touched upon, Dr. Rangachari, is the fact that there's this kind of discomfort with women doing these kind of profoundly amoral things to get a grasp of power, right? You mentioned the Vikramanka Deva Charita earlier. Now, Vikramaditya the Sixth is very often considered by historians to be the greatest of medieval Chalukya kings, despite the fact that he came to power by killing his elder brother and brutally put down a rebellion by his younger brother before commissioning the Vikramanka Deva Charita. Whereas in comparison, medieval queens who seize power in that sense are very often seen with these extremely negative connotations. And there's especially a discomfort with the fact that these queens who could be this ambitious and ruthless could also be very successful rulers.
Yes, absolutely. There are differential standards for assessing the rules of men and women in history. So for men, it is always, what are the battles they've won? How much have they extended the kingdom? What are their other achievements? Are they brave? Are they sort of larger than life figures? Whereas women who are always judged by their moral standards. Okay, was this person of good character? Was she pious? Was she religious? Was she actually gentle? So I have actually come across these grossly unfair comments on Didda. Now, Didda, to give a little bit of background, is she sort of ruled Kashmir, as I said, both formally and informally, for around 50 years. Very capable ruler, was able to quell a lot of dissensions, was able to bring a period of peace and prosperity to Kashmir, for all that time, and had no scruples about, actually killing her son and grandson to sort of get the throne of Kashmir, because she realized that they were not capable of ruling. But the whole idea of a woman wanting to rule and being so, having this naked ambition, has made a lot of historians call her notorious, dissolute. They focus on her lovers, how many lovers did she have? That shows that she was not of good character, and so on. Now, you never hear about this when you're, say, for example, talking about Lalitaditya of Kashmir, for example. Because he is seen as this absolutely effective ruler who went out and was able to make Kashmir powerful and built all these magnificent buildings and so on. And Didda might be doing the same thing, but you're looking at her from a very different viewpoint. So in fact, there are a lot of very respected historians who have actually vilified her for not committing sati after Kshemagupta died. They call this a sort of fatal weakness in her character, this love for power, this inability to end her life along with her husband and so on. And it's not just it's ironic, it's unfair, and it basically ends up distorting history so much that sometimes I have actually read secondary histories of Kashmir that either do not mention her at all or mention her in these very sort of dismissive lines, as in there was this woman, but she was very she was unnatural because she was not really a woman, because she dared to rule. And therefore, let's just forget about what she did, but let's focus on the male rulers who ruled before or after her, who might have just ruled for a couple of years, but who are seen as intrinsically more important because they were men.
50 years in medieval India is a long time. There aren't a lot of rulers who managed to hold. Exactly. And again, the irony that comes up is the way that Vikramaditya VI of the Chalukyas is kind of depicted, because he also rules for about 50 years. He is widely celebrated for it, even though he faced absolutely dreadful rebellions towards the end of his reign, which he was only barely able to put down. The Vikramanka Deva Charita celebrates him as a sexual athlete for the number of partners that he has, for how attractive he is to the women of the court and of the city of Kalyana. But Didda, in comparison, is instead treated in the exact opposite way. She's treated as some kind of demonic creature, if I can use that term.
Yes, absolutely.
For committing the sin of having multiple sexual partners at a time when men were also having multiple sexual partners and being celebrated for it. So this is absolutely fascinating. But before we conclude this conversation, Dr. Rangachari, I want to just understand a little bit more about Didda herself, because she kind of really exemplifies a lot of the themes that we have been touching upon through this conversation, in terms of how women are raised from secondary scholarship, in terms of how women could be ruthless and ambitious and also effective rulers, and in terms of how they kind of use the throne as a means towards advancing and fulfilling their ambitions. And most importantly, of course, the fact that medieval Kashmir was also a little unique in terms of the way that women were treated and the kind of roles that women played in its society and polity. So can you tell us a little bit about Didda's life? Who was this person? How did she come to the throne? How did she deal with rebellions against her rule? And how is she remembered? I'm not talking about historians, we've already dismissed that, but how is she remembered in Kashmir itself? How did she shape the landscape of Srinagar?
So, as you said, early medieval Kashmir is unique in that sense because, the presence of women, the public presence of women, is very remarkable. And of course, has been explained, or people have tried to explain it away through saying that, okay, maybe because it had a strong tribal content and, when you have tribal Moors, women are naturally more prominent. Or in fact, there's this study by Cynthia Talbot that says it's because medieval Kashmir resembled medieval Europe and, power was decentralized and, it could be personalized in particular families, which is why women were able to rule. And of course, regency. But of course, the fact is they used her regency as a stepping stone to acquire power. Where does she come from? She's actually from Lohara, which is to the southwest of Kashmir, and she is married to the ruler of Kashmir, Kshemagupta. She herself is lame. She has a deformed foot. So she needed to be carried around by this woman called Valga, whose presence Kalhana documents, who was also left behind a building. And, but despite that, she was able to understand, as Kalhana says, that her husband was useless, most ineffective, spending his time drinking and, going jackal hunting with his friends and so on. So she realized very quickly that he was not capable of ruling. And she realized in herself this talent of, being able to administer, being able to see what Kashmir needed, and, and of basically wanting to actualize her potential, her talent for actually ruling, for exercising power. And so she takes over the kingdom while her husband is alive, and he's quite happy to let her do it. And as we've already talked about the Dakshima coins, he was fascinated by her. So she, basically was dictating policy even when he was alive. When he dies subsequently, she becomes a regent for first her son Abhimanyu, and then for her 3 grandsons in succession, all of whom she definitely disposed of. Kalhana hints at it being done through witchcraft or whatever, but it's quite obvious that she managed to get rid of them. And then she crowns herself as former ruler of Kashmir in 980 AD, and again rules for 25 years. She issues inscriptions and coins, as I said, in both male and female titles, and she's able to deal. I mean, there are a lot of contenders to power that she manages to quell through a bribe and placation policy. She's also ruthless in killing a lot of her enemies. As Kalhana says, the waters of the Vitasa or the Jhelum basically run red in many phases of her rule, because she just decides that, she cannot allow mercy to be a factor that, dictates her policy in a lot of cases. So she's able to, and she's, in fact, one of her lovers, Tunga, she's able to raise to the rank of almost prime minister. He's a chief advisor, and he's also very capable because he's able to, quell rebellions. He's able to assist, neighboring rulers in various battles and so on. So she has also this talent of spotting, the similar talent in other people. So she's able to, and she's also supposed to build 64 buildings all over Kashmir, which of course Kalhana has this remarkable ability to sort of, before documenting a fact, to actually go and verify it. So in a case of a lot of rulers where they are documented as having built something, goes and actually verifies whether this building existed or not. And thereafter, Oral Stein, who undertook this English translation of the Rajtarangini, he also went and verified Kalhana's details. So both of them, so Stein actually notes that nothing survives of what Didda had built. But there is this memory in the Kashmir's landscape of his time that evoked the buildings. I mean, she's not just supposed to build religious structures, but also, rest houses for people, for travelers, and other kinds of secular buildings. And also, when she just before she realizes she's going to die, she actually, through a kind of contest, is able to select her nephew, her brother's son, as the one who will succeed her on the throne of Kashmir. So therefore, the throne, as I said, passes to her natal family of Lohara. She also makes Tunga her chief advisor, and this boy who will succeed her, Sangrama Raja. She makes them swear to not harm each other, because she also realizes human nature and what it can lead to. And her main concern is that Kashmir should not be sort of embroiled in any kind of bloody succession disputes or anything of the sort. So she ensures that when she dies, it just there is a peaceful succession. And so Sangrama Raja does go on to rule. Tunga does help him. He keeps to his vow. So, she's able to emphatically determine the future history of Kashmir in this way. How she is remembered, in fact, Stein says that there's a custom that the eldest female child of Kashmiri families were named Did. And he says this is in respectful recollection of the great queen. And, but, sadly, when I did, after Queen of Ice was written, my publisher actually sent me to do a couple of sessions in schools in Srinagar. And I was, quite sad to learn that Didda, as a person, as somebody who is a very legitimate part of the Kashmiri past, is not really remembered at all. Because I did a lot of sessions in different schools, and when I mentioned the name, everyone was blank. All the students were blank, and the teachers were more or less blank. So I don't know what kind of history they're learning. Of course, as I said, textbooks are also problematic in the sense that they can remove women and deal with them in the same way as as in mainstream histories, as in talking about what jewelry they wore and what clothes they wore, so that again generations of children grew up thinking women were not important in the past. So I actually had to tell these all these children to just walk across the road to the museum where Didda's coins and inscriptions are still there, and to understand what kind of part she played in their past. And they were all very interested in knowing about this person. They were wondering why they weren't taught more about her. They wanted to read the book to understand. And so I think right now in the current context, she's not really a factor, in the public memory. But when you go back to, say, the early 1900s, she was still very much known, as I said, because Stein, talks about her as being remembered with reverence and so on. So it's very sad how, over time, if you choose to invisibilize, anyone in history, they actually remain so, because, it's not as if everybody has access to the original sources or to knowledge about particular parts of the past. So I felt that it's really since I know all this about these women characters from the past, it becomes my responsibility to write about them for generations who will maybe understand that women were so remarkable in different phases of the past, and that they need to remember this.
Absolutely. What a fascinating discussion this has been, Dr. Rangachari. Let me thank you once again for the extremely important work that you're doing, and also for bringing up this somewhat sobering point about how when historical figures are invisibilized, they remain so. We are talking about a remarkable individual who dominated medieval Kashmir for 50 years and left a legacy that lasted for nearly 1,000 years before the histories that we chose to write in the 20th century erased her. And I would encourage all of our listeners to really think about how many other such figures have been erased from our understanding of India's history by these kinds of processes. There's one example of an entire bevy of fascinating medieval characters who come from all across this vast subcontinent. We have examples from the Deccan: Loka Mahadevi, Sheela Mahadevi, Mailala Devi, Rudra Mahadevi. If you look at medieval Odisha, we have a whole bunch of queens who ruled in the Bhaumakara dynasty. And if you go even further south, if you look at Tamilakam, for example, you will see Sambian Mahadevi and very important queens who clearly played an important role in shaping the forms that their kingdoms took, and therefore in shaping our history, who've all been erased from our understanding of who makes the past. And these are just examples from royal circles. I would encourage you to think about all the other quote-unquote non-royals as well, not just courtesans, but also farmers, agriculturalists, craftsmen, who are contributing to the material culture, contributing to the economies and societies of medieval India, and really shaping that world in very, very tangible ways, who have been erased and who have been forgotten, and who no longer play a conception, who no longer play a role in our conception of this very nationalist and royal male centric understanding of what is really an incredibly grand and incredibly complex unfolding of how we came to be who we are today. On that note, thank you so much, Dr. Rangachari. This has been one of the most fascinating discussions we've ever had on all things policy. Thank you so much for your fascinating research. We will have links to your books in the description of this podcast. I once again encourage all of you to check it out and buy it if you found this conversation interesting.
Yeah, thank you so much, Anirudh. I think you're doing wonderful work by bringing history to the public space. And thank you for giving me an opportunity to share my work with you and, my concerns with the writing of history. And in fact, I would urge those of you who are interested in sort of exploring this further to actually read the Raj Tarangani. It's available easily in English translation, just to see what a fascinating text it is, and what a wonderful historian Kalhana was. And in fact, there are in later ages after Didda, he actually evaluates the reigns of a couple of male rulers, saying, look at them, they're men and they're supposed to rule. And, they don't even match up to Didda, at all. I mean, look at the way she ruled and look at the way they're ruling. So, little interesting glimpses of how aware he was of the capabilities of women. So it just supports the fact that the modern texts carry a heavier load of gender blindness than the primary sources sometimes. So thank you so much for this, Anirudh.
Thank you. It was my pleasure. And thank you all for listening to All Things Policy.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
Hi everybody, just wanted to ask everyone for a quick favor. We're running a brand survey right now and would really appreciate it if you could let us know what you think about the advertising on IVM. Go to ivmpodcast.com/survey and do let us know. As part of this, we'll be selecting 10 random participants and sending them some IVM swag, so do fill out those surveys.
Do you know Tamil? Tamil Puriyuma? Do your children enjoy great stories that inculcate good values? Hi, I am Ravishankar Balachandran and I host the Storytime Tamil podcast. I am excited to share a short story with great moral values every day. Listen to Storytime Tamil on the IVM Podcast app, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts from.